For most of the 20th century, geography textbooks listed the Aral Sea as the fourth largest lake on the planet, a vast inland sea straddling the border of Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, roughly the size of Ireland. Fishing boats worked its waters, ports bustled with trade, and tens of thousands of people built their entire lives around its shoreline. Today, much of that shoreline no longer exists. In its place lies a cracked, salt-crusted desert that scientists now call the Aralcum, a wasteland so vast it can be seen from space. For decades, the Aral Sea stood as the textbook example of environmental collapse, a warning about what happens when human ambition outpaces ecological caution. But in one small corner of that disaster, something remarkable has been happening. Water is returning. Fish are swimming again. Towns that were left stranded, sometimes tens of kilometers from open water, are slowly being reconnected to a living sea. This is the story of how a small piece of one of the worst environmental catastrophes in modern history is being pulled back from the edge. To understand the recovery, it helps to understand the collapse. Until the early 1960s, the Aral Sea was fed by two great rivers, the Amu Darya and the Sir Darya, both of which carried snowmelt down from the mountains of Central Asia. Soviet planners looked at that water and saw an opportunity. They wanted to transform the arid plains of Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan into a cotton empire, and cotton needs enormous quantities of irrigation. Engineers built a sprawling network of canals, many of them unlined and leaking, that siphoned off the rivers before they ever reached the sea. The Soviet authorities largely accepted this trade in advance. Reports from the era show that planners understood the sea would shrink as a result of the irrigation scheme and simply judged the cotton harvest to be worth more than the lake. What they perhaps did not fully anticipate was the speed and scale of the destruction that followed. The results were staggering. Between the 1960s and the 1990s, the Aral Sea lost the majority of its volume. As the water retreated, it left behind a dry seabed loaded with agricultural salts, pesticide residue, and industrial contamination that had been dumped into the rivers upstream for decades. Winds regularly picked up this toxic dust and carried it across the region, dropping it onto farmland, villages, and the lungs of everyone living nearby. Local hospitals reported sharp increases in respiratory illness, anemia, and other health problems tied to the pollution. The climate itself began to change as the sea disappeared. Without a large body of water to moderate the temperature, summers in the region grew hotter and drier, while winters turned harsher and more extreme. The fishing industry, which had once landed tens of thousands of tons of fish a year and supported entire towns, collapsed entirely. Ports like Moynak in Uzbekistan, once a thriving harbor, became infamous for their rusting fishing boats stranded on dry land, sometimes more than 100 kilometers from the nearest water. It was, by almost any measure, one of the fastest and most complete ecological disasters ever caused by human activity. By the 1980s, the sea had split into two separate bodies of water, a smaller northern portion in Kazakhstan and a much larger southern portion shared with Uzbekistan. The two halves behaved very differently, and that difference would eventually matter enormously. The northern sea was smaller, shallower, and fed by the Sir Darya River, while the southern sea, fed by the Amu Darya, continued to shrink at a much faster rate because far more of its river water was being consumed by irrigation before it ever arrived. As the 1990s began and the Soviet Union dissolved, the newly independent nation of Kazakhstan found itself in control of the smaller northern sea and its remaining fishing communities, while Uzbekistan inherited the much larger, much more heavily damaged southern sea. That political split, arbitrary as it may have seemed at the time, set the stage for two very different futures. Kazakhstan made a decision that many outside observers considered close to hopeless. Rather than accepting that the entire Aral Sea was doomed, officials decided to try to save what remained of the smaller northern portion, even if it meant essentially sacrificing any realistic hope for the much larger southern sea. The first attempt came in the early 1990s, when local engineers and residents tried to build a simple earthen dam using dump trucks and sand, an improvised barrier meant to stop water from draining out of the north and disappearing into the shrinking south. It was a desperate, low-budget effort, and it did not hold. The makeshift dam eventually washed away, and for a while it looked as though even this partial rescue attempt had failed. But the idea behind that crude dam was sound, and it caught the attention of international engineers and development banks. In the early 2000s, the World Bank partnered with the government of Kazakhstan to fund a far more ambitious and technically serious version of the same concept. The result was the North Aral Dam, a reinforced structure roughly 12 to 13 kilometers long, built southwest of the delta where the Syr Darya River empties into what remained of the Northern Sea. Completed in 2005 as part of a larger project known as the Syr Darya Control and North Aral Sea Initiative, the dam cost somewhere in the neighborhood of $85 to $86 million. Its purpose was straightforward: hold back the water flowing in from the Syr Darya, stop it from leaking south into the deeper, salter, and largely unsalvageable remains of the Southern Sea, and let the smaller northern basin fill back up on its own. The results arrived far faster than almost anyone had predicted. Engineers and hydrologists had estimated it might take 5 to 10 years for the Northern Sea to show meaningful recovery. Instead, within just a matter of months of the dam's completion, water levels in the North Aral Sea rose by more than 3 meters. Some estimates put the increase closer to 11 feet in under a year, a pace that stunned even the scientists who had designed the project. As the water rose, the surface area of the Northern Sea expanded, and crucially, the salinity of the water began to drop. Before the dam, salt concentrations in the northern basin had climbed so high that only a single hardy species, the flounder, was able to survive there in any real numbers. Everything else had been driven out by water that was, in places, salter than the ocean itself. Once the dam went up and fresh river water no longer had anywhere to escape to, the sea slowly diluted and the ecosystem began, cautiously, to come back. The most visible sign of that recovery has been fish. As salinity fell, freshwater and brackish species that had disappeared from the Northern Sea decades earlier began returning through the Syr Darya Delta. Fisheries scientists have documented roughly 20 species reappearing in numbers healthy enough to support commercial harvest, including bream, roach, and a particularly valuable predator known locally as pike perch or zander, which fishermen have taken to calling their gold because of how much it commands in local markets. The fishing numbers tell a striking story of their own. In 2006, the year after the dam's completion, the annual catch in the Northern Sea was measured at roughly 1,300 tons, a fraction of what the region had once produced. By 2018, the fishing quota had climbed to more than 8,000 tons, an increase of several hundred% in just over a decade. More recent figures suggest the catch has held in that same range, with some reports placing the annual harvest around 8,000 tons as of the mid-2020s, supported now by roughly 24 recovered fish species and a growing network of processing plants, several of which have earned European Union certification and now export Aral Sea fish to more than a dozen countries. The economic ripple effects have reshaped daily life in towns along the northern shoreline. Aralsk, once one of the busiest fishing ports on the entire Aral Sea, had become a symbol of the disaster by the 1990s, its harbor left dry, and its fishing fleet abandoned on cracked, salt-white ground kilometers from any water. The town still sits roughly 30 kilometers from today's shoreline, a reminder that even this partial recovery has real limits. But the return of a functioning fishing industry has brought investment, jobs, and a sense of momentum back to a region that had spent a generation watching its economy disappear along with the sea. Families that once relied on camels as their main livestock because fishing had become impossible are once again finding work on boats and in processing facilities. For a community that had essentially been written off, that shift carries a weight that goes beyond economics. Kazakhstan has not stopped at the original dam. In recent years, officials have pursued a series of follow-up projects aimed at pushing the recovery even further. Work has continued on reinforcing and raising sections of the North Aral Dam itself, alongside repairs to smaller dikes and canals throughout the Syr Darya Delta designed to route more water toward the sea rather than losing it to evaporation or leakage along the way. According to Kazakhstan's Ministry of Water Resources and Irrigation, The volume of water held in the Northern Sea climbed from roughly 19 billion cubic meters at the start of 2022 to more than 22 billion cubic meters by early 2025, with projections suggesting it could reach around 23.5 billion cubic meters by the end of that year. The surface area of the reservoir has grown alongside it, expanding by more than 100 square kilometers in just a couple of years. None of this restores the Aral Sea to what it once was, but it represents real, measurable, ongoing progress rather than a one-time success story that stalled out. Some of the most interesting work has happened away from the water entirely, in the rice paddies and farmland that surround the delta. Much of the water lost to the original disaster wasn't stolen by a single dramatic project. It leaked away gradually through inefficient irrigation channels and wasteful farming practices repeated across millions of hectares. In response, agricultural officials in Kazakhstan's Kyzylorda region have promoted laser-guided field leveling technology on local rice farms, a method that flattens fields with much greater precision than traditional plowing, allowing water to spread evenly and soak in efficiently instead of pooling, running off, or evaporating in the sun. Applied across tens of thousands of hectares, this single change is estimated to have saved hundreds of millions of cubic meters of water that can now be redirected toward the sea instead of being wasted in the fields. As a side benefit, farmers using the leveled fields have reported noticeably higher crop yields, meaning the same intervention that helps the sea recover is also making local agriculture more productive and more profitable. It's important to be clear about the limits of this story, because the recovery of the Northern Aral Sea is not the same as saving the Aral Sea. The much larger southern portion of the lake, the part shared by Uzbekistan, has continued to shrink and has largely been left to dry out. In its place sits the Aralkum Desert, tens of thousands of square kilometers of exposed seabed laced with salt and agricultural chemical residue, and the source of dust storms that still carry pollutants across the region and affect the health of people living hundreds of kilometers away. Researchers working in communities near the former southern shoreline have documented elevated levels of pesticide residue and heavy metals in blood and breast milk samples, along with higher rates of respiratory illness and other health problems that trace directly back to decades of exposure to that toxic dust. No dam, however well engineered, is going to reverse that damage or bring the Southern Sea back to life. The scale of water needed to refill it, water that would have to come from rivers already stretched thin by agriculture across several countries, simply isn't realistic given current water use in the region. What makes the Northern Aral Sea story worth telling isn't that it undoes everything that went wrong. It's that it proves partial recovery is possible and that a relatively modest, well-targeted intervention, a single dam roughly a dozen kilometers long combined with smarter water management upstream, can produce results far beyond what almost anyone predicted at the outset. It's a case study now taught in environmental science and water policy courses around the world, a rare example of a human-caused ecological collapse being meaningfully, if incompletely, reversed. The fishermen pulling bream and pike perch out of the ice near Aralsk today are working waters that many experts assumed would never support a fishing industry again. The rising water levels recorded year after year by Kazakhstan's water ministry represent a slow, steady rebuilding of something that was nearly lost for good. The Aral Sea will likely never again be the fourth largest lake on Earth. The Southern Sea's fate appears effectively sealed, a permanent reminder of what large-scale mismanagement of a shared resource can do to an entire region. But in the north, behind a dam built from lessons learned after an earlier failed attempt, a genuine ecosystem has come back from the edge of extinction. Fish are being caught, processed, and shipped to markets across multiple continents. Towns that had resigned themselves to decline are seeing new investment and new hope. Water levels that scientists once assumed would take a decade to rise instead climbed in a matter of months, and they have kept climbing since. It is not a complete victory, and it never will be. But it is proof that even after one of the worst environmental disasters in modern history, recovery, however partial, however hard-fought, remains possible.